ask you to record it. Terrific. Okay, thank you very much. All right, folks. Well, I sent you some preliminary, I sent you some documents that I had kind of put together as I was thinking about doing this. Let me give you some background in terms of why we thought this might be helpful. We do have a few small churches that don't have moderators because they don't have pastors, or we have some smaller churches that have pastors who are serving who are not PCUSA pastors. And constitutionally, we have to have a PCUSA moderator. So there's two different kind of situations. One, you might be, quote unquote, if you do choose to pursue perhaps moderating one of these smaller churches, you might be working with someone who's functioning as the pastor, or you may just simply be moderating while they're trying to discern what their steps are and as they do pulpit supply. So that's kind of our context. And we thought, as a matter of fact, some of how this appeared was Kate Colucci Estes sits on COM, and she was asked as a COM person to moderate Smyrna Church a few years ago. And she said, you know, I've been in specialized validated ministry. I've never moderated a session before. She did a great job, but she was nervous about it because she's like, I've never done that before. And so she wasn't really sure. And so she sits on the subcommittee of COM. And we thought that this might be an opportunity to get people who don't normally moderate validated, associate pastors, there might be some honorably retired or whatever, who might be interested in doing this as a service to the presbytery, as well as learning more about moderating. So that's a little bit of the context as to why we're offering this time together. I want to say also that this is very informal, so please interrupt at any point in time, questions, comments, or whatever. I really want to look at the document that I did send. Jill, did somebody get that for you? So everybody's got it? Okay. I basically just kind of want to go through this, and then at the end, there's some sticky situations, and some of you who have moderated in the past may have some case studies that we can then talk about in terms of how, as a moderator, would you deal with some of those things. The important thing about being a moderator is, as it's described in the Book of Order, is that you really have two responsibilities. You preserve order in the body, and you help the business get conducted efficiently and thoroughly and allow voices to be heard. So that's really what a moderator does. As we all know, a lot of times pastors will say a little bit of their own thought process about things, but to be really technical, you're really not supposed to do that. You're supposed to allow the body to do the work that they need to do, but insert yourself if they're getting off track or if they need clarification. So Steve Sankey has joined us. Steve, welcome. We're going through the document that I said. Do you want to just take a minute? We just kind of got started. Just to introduce yourself real briefly, just so we know who you are.
Great. Steve Sankey. I'm a chaplain at Wellstar. I work at Kennestone up in Marietta. I've been in a lot of session meetings, so I'm really glad to learn how to do it. And maybe how to do it decently and in order.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. As I was putting this together, in some respects, it was a little difficult because moderating almost feels instinctual to me, as opposed to like you actually learn how to do it. But there is some learning curves involved with it. So as I go through this document, what are your responsibilities as a moderator? Usually you're the person that opens the meeting with either a prayer or a devotional or some kind of an opening to kind of set the scene. Your attitude really does help, and being on time really helps. People's time is valuable, and so it's important to begin when you say you're going to begin. You are the person that really starts the meeting when you call it to order. However, a meeting in the PCUSA is not legal unless a quorum is declared. You can mark everybody present on your attendance, the clerk does, but I tell my clerks, if you don't formally declare that there's a quorum, that is not a legal meeting. So you need to make sure that a quorum is officially declared and that your clerk definitely puts that in the minutes. Your primary job is to help facilitate debate and discussion, to allow all voices to be heard, and to clarify the issues that are being discussed. A lot of times people will start to go into tangents. I'm sure that, yeah, Russ.
Where do we get the idea that the quorum has to be declared for the meeting to be legal?
We get that from a PJC case that happened a long, long time ago, that went all the way up to the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission. It was a tiny little church with 3 elders. They were all present. They did business, but somebody challenged that business and they lost because the quorum was not formally declared in the minutes.
Okay, so my next question, if we're looking at a congregation other than our own,
right,
and we have not been able to familiarize ourselves with the bylaws, how do we know what constitutes a quorum for their session?
Okay, well, that's a good question, because one of the first things that I'm going to do is, if you do choose to moderate, I am going to put you in touch first with the congregational consultant that works with that church to get kind of some background information on the church, how many people are on the session. I have a document, I can't remember if I sent it to you, but I have a document of, I think there's about 8 churches right now where we're looking at possibilities for quorums. I have the number of who's on the session, but the congregational consultant will be able to help you with that, Russ, to tell you what constitutes quorum. Generally speaking, it's 50% plus 1. Now, there are some issues in terms of, for example, Jackson, I don't know, Becky, when you were there, but currently they have 6 on session. You should always, you know, well, a lot of people have 6. Sorry, I take that back. Somebody has 4. That's what it is. Manchester Warm Springs has 4. That's a problem, because you could have 2 and 2, and then that's difficult. But they have 4 on their session, so hopefully they've made it work. So, but that's the only church you'll encounter. So, does that help, Russ?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. So, so yes, the quorum is declared, and then you can start to begin your business. I thought this was an interesting comment that I had read: to control the process and not the people. I think that's hard to do. Now, it may not be as hard in a situation, as Russ says, where you don't really know the people yet. You're still getting to know the people in your own church. And Russ, I mean, where you already know a lot of people, and Becky, where you know the people, that may be a little bit harder to do. But it's important. It's really important, especially in our theology, is they have to do the work. It's their work. It's their church. It's not your church. Pastors don't like to hear that, but it's really not your church. It's their church. And so they need to be empowered the best way they can to make those decisions. When you sense that the body is ready, then as the moderator, you will call for the vote if there is a motion, of course, on the floor. And as a reminder, you will not be installed in any of these. Only installed pastors have the ability to vote. So you would not be able to vote in any of these kinds of situations. And then, of course, you conclude it with prayer. One of the things that I thought would be helpful as you get started, especially in a new environment where you don't know folks, is again to talk to the congregational consultant, but also to contact the clerk and see if you can have a sit-down meeting with the clerk. Get to talk with the clerk. How do they normally do things? Every church has their own little culture and their own little nuance. Sometimes the pastor totally does the agenda. It's really actually the clerk's responsibility to do the agenda, but a lot of times that doesn't happen. But hopefully the clerk is working with, if they have a pastor, to do the agenda, and if they don't, with you as the moderator to do that agenda. So hopefully then you can get to know that person, know how they like to operate. Also, what is the culture of the church? Joy told me one of her churches, Fellowship, tiny little church, they all come to the session meeting because they got to wait for the 3 elders to finish the session meeting because they all carpool home. So that's their culture. That's something that you have to deal with as a moderator, which we'll talk about later. But that's a cultural thing and pertinent to that church. Certainly not everybody has that. Some session meetings are open. That would be a conversation you would have with the clerk. Technically, by Robert's rules, session meetings are not open meetings unless you've made that declaration that they are open. So normally someone needs to be invited to come, unless your habit and your stance is that your meetings are open. So you would need to find that out first from the church, again, from the clerk, hopefully what that is.
Donna, I have a question.
Yeah, go right ahead, Joe.
So where it says preparation before the meeting, number 2.
Yeah.
It says, feel free to invite the pastor to open the meeting with prayer. It'll also be up to you on how much input and direction the pastor will have in the meeting. Remind me why we would be moderating if there is a pastor.
Okay. For example, Kelly Presbyterian Church, their pastor is an AME pastor. Her name is Millicent Thompson. She's wonderful and she'll be really cooperative, but she's not allowed to moderate because she's not Peace USA. So we actually have, and we have another church who is being led by a Methodist pastor. And we have another church that is being led by like a candidate who's not ordained. So we have at least 3 churches that we know need a Peace USA moderator. Russ.
So Donna, just clarifying question then, for those pastors to be engaged in the meeting, will the congregational consultant know if there's been a standing rule for them to have voice in the meeting, or does that need to be addressed each time? How's that properly handled?
The consultant will know. My suspicion, and I'm not intimately know these churches, but my suspicion is that the pastor is involved in the meeting. For example, Millicent, Al Myers was the moderator. He'd been moderating a lot of our small churches for a long time. It's also a good relationship if they do have a pastor to look and work with that pastor. How can we do this together? I do the moderating because we have to be decent in order, but how much influence do you talk a lot? I mean, those are things hopefully the consultant will know, and hopefully those are things that you'll witness, because if they really do talk a lot and really direct a lot, that's one of the sticky situations, because they're not they really shouldn't be doing it. Chip.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to the consultant, Russ and others, you're going to rely a lot on the clerk of session to help you understand what the traditions are there and what the protocols are that are in place.
Right. And it's perfectly fine for those folks to have voice, but if, and these are things that you'll encounter, and you can't change things overnight, because some things, and I'm going to even tell you about a situation that was a problematic situation. Hopefully, if they do have a pastor and it's a good working relationship, that they'll talk with you about, it's helpful for you to have comments and for input, but we really want to help the people make their own decisions about things. I mean, if they ask you things, but you don't want them to dominate the meeting. And I don't think they do, but again, I'm not involved in those churches, but the consultant will know that, Russ, for sure. So if there is a pastor there, that might be a way of, do you want them to go ahead and open with prayer? Do you want them to go ahead and do the devotional? That's one way to kind of incorporate the pastor, because these people do look at them as their pastor, if they have such a pastor. If they don't have a pastor, then obviously that's your responsibility, and that helps set the tone and all of that kind of stuff. And the more you do it, the more you'll get to know the ethos of the group and the people. Now, most of these churches only meet quarterly, and that's because they just don't have a whole lot of business to do, because most of these churches are under 35 people. So that's that situation. Okay. Again, I would also, in preparation for the meeting, I would ask the clerk, is there something that you think will be controversial that's coming to the session meeting? And also help them. They need to give you the agenda. They need to give you all the information, and also kind of walk you through, oh, this is standard. This is, some of these churches don't even have committees because they're so small. So-and-so though will tell you about the Sunday picnic or whatever. But you do want to ask them beforehand, because one of the things that you might need to do, and I would get calls 8 o'clock at night, in the middle of session meetings, wanting a rule on something or other. So it's better if you know something beforehand is controversial, and then you can figure out how do you deal with it if somebody makes an amendment, if somebody wants to do this with it, table it. How do you parliamentary deal with that so that you're in preparation for that issue, as well as to help set the tone if something's going to be controversial, so that people don't automatically get their dander up. Hopefully that won't happen often, but it certainly can, depending on the issue. As a matter of fact, Bremen, we're having that problem right now. Bobby Wren, I hate to tell you that. So we're having an issue in Bremen. So you never know. You just never know. All righty. I also advise you, when you get your agenda, if you need to, if it's helpful, go ahead and mark it up. You know, put in red what is an action item, so that you make sure that it gets acted on. What is an information item? That's another thing. Do they supply written reports? A lot of these smaller churches might not do that. They might have just a verbal report. So hopefully the clerk then is taking down the essential pieces of the verbal report. But if you don't have anything to look at beforehand, that's also why the clerk is helpful. What do you think is coming? What kind of report might they have? And if they do have action items, if they have not been instructed, that might be something as the moderator. And you can even use your own sense of, you know, guys, I'm just getting to know you. It would be really helpful to me if you put any action items down beforehand, so that I know what's coming to the meeting, so that we can deal with it together. And you can even, you can even plead your own sense of, I'm new at this. And so that would be helpful to me if you would do that, if they're not used to doing that. Because a lot of small churches, again, may not do that. Please do find out if there are materials distributed. And if it's only the agenda, hopefully you don't get it the morning of or the day before, that you can talk with them about it. Now, a lot of these churches currently that are needing moderators are not meeting via Zoom. They are meeting in person. So that is a piece of information for you. So as you contemplate, if you want to take something on, if you're not comfortable yet meeting in person, that's fine. But I wanted you to be aware of that. And then there's one church in particular who's in need of a moderator that they refuse to mask. So I would tell you that in advance. Obviously, if you choose not to go there, we would understand that, because we're not having a lot of people that are choosing to do that if people are not masking. So if they are willing to do a virtual meeting, make sure you have the link. Who's going to set that all up? How's it going to be distributed to everybody? I had a terrible situation a week and a half ago. A candidate came for CPM, and the link didn't get sent to the candidate. And so they were pounding on the presbytery door, thinking that the meeting was going to be at the presbytery office. So I got a phone call. We got it all worked out, but those are some of those background logistics that you just need to make sure that everybody's on the same page with. So we don't want that to happen to you. So, okay, first time meeting with a session. Let me ask you before we even do that, the first time any of you who have moderated, like Bobby Wren, do you recall, what did you do the first time you met with the session? Did you do anything special or anything? You're muted, yeah. You're on mute. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
There you go. Did you do anything special that you remember?
I don't think any more than the prayer and the devotional or prayer and just going around the room and introducing ourselves. I don't remember anything special beyond that.
Okay. George, how about you? Do you remember anything special? Russ or Sam or anybody do anything other than that kind of stuff? Anybody do anything special? Russ, go ahead.
For me, one of the things that I did when I came to the first session, and I remind them sort of on the first session meeting of the new class every time, is I set the expectations of what I'm there for as the moderator.
Okay.
As you just said, folks, here's our agenda. It's a participatory agenda process. So this is what we've planned to do. Are there things that need added or subtracted? Here's our time frame here. So we're all starting on the same page with it. And then the other thing that I'm particularly mindful of is making sure that every elder has the opportunity to speak even if they choose not to. And sometimes that means, and you've got to get to know the session a little first. Obviously, that doesn't happen real well in the first meeting.
Right.
But making sure that for those introverts who are processors, that you give them time to call out on a discussion item rather than just zooming through the business.
I really like the idea of setting the expectations. And as I wrote down further somewhere here, if they have a pastor, you know, they may not feel fabulous about you being there because why do you have to be here? And so part of that expectation is saying, you know, my job is, you know, I'm bound constitutionally. We have to have a PCUSA moderator. Yes, if they have a pastor, this is your pastor. I understand all that. I'm just here to help you do the decent and in order thing. So that's part of the expectations, as well to diffuse some of that, and just be aware that there may be a little resentment or whatever as to why their pastor can't moderate.
I unmuted. So
yeah, George, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just culturally, you know, it was interesting because I had a multicultural congregation.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which people communicate, listen, touching on what Russ was saying earlier, you know, for some cultures, you have to kind of be patient with them and encourage the conversation. And I think setting the tone of it being the work of the church, and so it's sacred and set apart. It's not a business meeting. It is the work of the church. And what we're doing is trying to discern where God's calling the church. And so I think, you know, really setting it up with a devotional, but emphasizing that this is the work of the church can really diffuse a lot of the tension that comes about when people want to have a win and somebody to have a loss. They want to get their way, to say that we're looking for the win-win here. We're actually looking for the win for the kingdom. So
that's a great comment. This is not just a business meeting. There's a whole lot more involved, and that is helpful to remind people of that. That's excellent. Anybody else have anything to add? Tully?
So, yeah, whenever I've moderated in the past, I've almost always been the associate pastor who was moderating. And so a reminder that all the pastors get to vote in all the meetings, and that the moderator always gets to vote if they are a pastor. But there's a very common belief, and might be true in board meetings, that the moderator only gets to vote to break a tie. And so I often remind people that that is not the case, that your pastor, your installed pastor, does get to vote every time on every issue.
You know, and that's really an interesting comment that you made, because there is it's a question: should the moderator vote if they're installed? Is that undue influence with the body? I never voted as a moderator when I moderated sessions. I never voted ever, not once. That might be old school. I mean, we're talking a long time ago, so longer than y'all have been ordained, I'm sure. I don't know what do they talk? I don't know if they even talk about that in seminary. Do you vote, Russ? Do you vote, Becky? Well, you're not installed, Becky, but Russ, you are installed. Do you vote?
I have voted once at Good
Once, okay.
And that was a tie over an overture to go to presbytery.
Okay, well, and the moderator does break a tie. That is something that you do. But that is something you'll have to think about. Now, in most of these situations, there won't be any other installed pastors, so you won't need to deal with that. But if you ever do encounter that, that's a question. Chip, did you want to say something about it? I see your.
Sure. I would just say I didn't vote often because generally there was pretty much consensus, so there wasn't a need to, unless it was something I felt strongly about. If there was a need to break a tie, I declined to vote because I felt like if I needed to break a tie, then more work needed to be done on that issue.
Thank you. That's helpful insight as well. So yeah, Becky.
I was installed in the beginning, and they did that so I could be ordained. And I did occasionally vote, and I appreciate Chip's input because I did vote in the rare case where it was a tie and I felt very strongly about it. And I was probably the one who was going to have to do the work.
That does indeed happen.
It does indeed. So, but I appreciate what Chip said. I think if he's right, if it's that close, it doesn't need to be what you want. It needs to be.
Well, and I think it's a discernment thing, especially
It
if you're
is.
eligible to vote,
Right.
And anyway, it's a good discussion point for you as yourself. And of course, as I said, in most of these churches, that's not going to be an issue because there's not any installed person. But if you
But
ever
part
do,
of it is who has to do the action that you're voting on.
yeah,
And if they're asking you to do something that's outside your skill set or the time available, or there's not likely to be a lot of help with, in other words, if their expectations are unrealistic, but if you're just moderating someone else's session, it would never be an issue.
yes, it will not be, because and that's in these situations that we're looking for, that will be the situation. But that I'm glad you said that, Tully, because that is I get that a lot. I get a lot of contract people thinking they can vote, and I have to tell them, no, you can't vote. And so it's helpful to be reminded that yes, you are entitled to vote if you so choose to do so. So, all righty, I put
I
on
have
here.
two questions, Donna.
Huh?
I have two questions. So for
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
reference, for the reference, so where I can find that the law or the constitutional about the contract pastor and the installed pastor can vote and or cannot vote.
I will give you that. As a matter of fact, we just did a chart for Committee on Ministry because we have that question so often.
Mhm.
So let me just find the quotation in the Book of Order. Let me see. It is in there. Here it is. G, you got a pencil or whatever? It's G3.
G3.
G3.0201.
Okay.
Where it talks about the composition of the session. I'll read it real fast. What did I say? 30201. Okay. All righty. Composition and responsibilities of the session. The session is the council for the congregation. It shall be composed of those persons elected by the congregation to active service as ruling elders, together with all installed pastors and associate pastors. So that's where it defines what the composition is. So you have to be installed in order to be able to vote.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Is that the only question, or did you have another one?
Oh yeah, that's the only one.
Okay, great. Okay. Some of the things that I thought about that you could begin with in your first meeting is to go ahead and take some time and have people share their faith journeys or their faith stories, maybe just a few minutes, especially if there's only, 3 or 4 people. You certainly probably can do a good 5 minutes a piece or whatever. But if you do want to do that, this also helps you to get to know them a little bit as well as you're beginning this relationship. You do need to give them a heads up. I mean, as an introvert, I would not want to just be slammed with that right in me. Oh, tell us about your faith journey. And so I would want a little heads up on that. So that's why I say you may want to go ahead and put it on the agenda so that people are aware that there's going to be that kind of sharing time. And of course, not only just opening prayer, but joys and concerns is always a good way, because it also is a good way to get to know what's going on in the congregation as well. Even though you're moderating a session, and if they don't have a pastor, you'll get to have a little bit of a flavor about the congregation as well, even though you won't necessarily be there worshiping with them or whatever, but you probably will get to know some of that, because in these smaller churches that are very family oriented, you're going to hear about a lot of that stuff. So that's a helpful thing. And if they do have a pastor, you might want to ask them about what they think would be helpful for you to how to get to know these people, because they do know these people, but what would be helpful? What do they think would be helpful to help get to know these people and for them to get to know you? Because it really is all about establishing some trust relationship if it's going to go well, because you want to respect comes, in my opinion, from trust. And that's what's going to make things run more smoothly and efficiently, as well as the agreeing to disagree. When there's a trust factor, there's the ability to do that on a higher level, in my opinion. Okay, on the next page, one of the
Hey,
things
Donna,
that,
quick
yeah, go
quick
ahead.
question. What do you call it when you put it on the agenda? Trust building exercise?
No, I would say, let's say we're going to share our faith stories. I would say, you know, a few minutes for each of us to introduce ourselves and to share our faith stories, however you want to say it. I would not use trust building exercise. You know, and if it's going to be a sharing of your joys and concerns, or when did you join this church? What is your favorite thing about this church? What keeps you coming to this church? What is your favorite memory of an event that happened at this church? I mean, some way for them to share a little bit about themselves that will also give you some information about the church. Does that make sense, Tully? Okay. All right. Procedures with small boards and committees. I attended a parliamentary procedure by Tricia Dykers Koenig, who is an assistant stated clerk in the General Assembly office, who's just phenomenal. And she reminded me that there is, in Robert's rules, there is the ability for small boards and committees, which these would be considered small boards and committees, that, excuse me, you can have an informal discussion first before you have a motion on the table. And that is just really a helpful thing, because then you can really process things and hash things and say, oh, you know, I think the nursery should be painted yellow. Oh, well, you know, that yellow before it faded and we should maybe do it blue. It's a brighter color. I mean, so you don't have all these motions and have to amend them and vote them down and all that. And depending on if it's certainly, and even if it's controversial, to get all of those opinions out before you really have something formalized to vote on. It's just really helpful, because then hopefully you can also get the read of the room as the moderator. Are we 50-50 here? Are we in kind of consensus? Are we leaning in this way? Is somebody having an aha moment? Oh, I didn't think about that. Maybe I do want to do that. And then that way, the vote is smoother and easier. And if it really is still very divided, as Chip said, it may be that you say, you know, I still hear in this conversation that we're really divided. Maybe we should take this up the next time we meet and pray about it, think about it. What would be a good way? Have some Bible study about it, or something to do that we can then learn more about this subject and topic, so that we might be able to come to greater consensus. So I really encourage that, and especially in these smaller churches that a lot of them are going to operate like that anyway. I would encourage that, as opposed to go ahead and getting a motion on the floor where then you have to follow a lot of parliamentary procedure. I've actually been in meetings. I was in a CON meeting and someone said, Donna, you can't do that. And I said, well, I'm doing it anyway. I mean, there was a motion and there was a lot of talk. And I said, guys, we're starting all over again. Okay, we're taking this motion off the table. We're just going to have some conversation. So, anyway, okay. So where am I? So I would encourage that for sure. I already talked about smaller churches. They have their own culture, 3 or 6 members, get the lay of the land. I told you about the one church that brings everybody with. Joy indicated this to me, that some of these churches have really loose nominating processes and they don't rotate elders. Now, as just the moderator, this isn't like totally your purview to totally deal with. In some respects, it's the consultants, but and you won't know just walking in there, have they rotated people? I mean, you won't know that unless you're there for a few years and see if they rotate anybody, or even find out, you know, well, how, you know, we have to do elders this coming year. You know, how do you do that here? How do you do your nominating committee? Joy wanted me to pass along that was one area where she thought, as a moderator, that you might be able to have some teaching opportunities to help them have a better nominating process. Now, the difficulty with that is the Book of Order actually changed. It got clarified, but the minimum amount of people for a nominating committee is 3. Now, if you have a church that's 12 people, that's going to be hard to get a formalized nominating committee that's voted on by the congregation. But you can still try, but I'm just saying there will be some other dynamics. I think the main thing is there a way to help churches encourage rotation of leadership? That's really the one constitutional thing that's a problem that smaller churches do, by having the same people serve for years and years and years and not let any new people in at all, even if they're small. So I just simply lift that up as just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We'll talk about parliamentary procedure in a few minutes, but I want what?
Just a quick clarifying question on that. When you talk about rotation of elders, I know a lot, is that normally found within the bylaws of each congregation as to whether they are term limited or not? Or how do we find out what their history is?
Well, their bylaws should have what is their nominating process. All bylaws are supposed to say what is their nominating process. Now, I have come to learn because of the clerk training that I do, because I asked them about all that. A lot of them don't have updated bylaws. I keep going and going and going and going. I have a template. So, I mean, if you even encounter, we don't really even know, we don't even know where they are. Maybe they're in the basement somewhere or whatever. I have a template that's very, very simple in terms of what the bylaws are and or what you have to have in the bylaws. And I'm happy to send that, whatever. And that could be something that you as moderator could help them work through, or help a committee work, say, let's have 2 or 3 people and see if we can figure out what makes sense for us here. So, but hopefully they have it in their bylaws. And so if they do, then you just follow what the bylaws say. It can be a variety of things. Some churches have the chairs of all their committees form the nominating committee. Other people say, way back in the day, it used to be this many women, this many men. If there's racial, ethnic, they don't have any of that anymore. The only thing that is required is a current sitting elder needs to be on the nominating committee. So that's at least 1 current sitting elder, and then 2, if you only have a nominating committee of 3, are from the congregation. The other hard and steadfast rule is that you have to have more people from the congregation than you do on the session, so that you have a greater number of people. So if you have 2 people that are on the session, you have to have at least 3 people then from the congregation on your nominating committee. And part of the reason for that is, again, so they don't keep nominating themselves and electing themselves over and over and over again, so that it gets input from the congregation. So that's why it has to be a majority. So if you do run into that, and again, your congregational consultant might be able to find that out. And it may be, if you do choose to do one of these, you can say, as a new moderator, these would be some things to help me get to know you. Can you send me a copy of your bylaws so I know a little bit about how you do things here in this church? That might be an opportunity. Steve, you wanted to say something. Sorry, I couldn't see your hand raised.
That's all right. Question about the nominating committee.
Yes.
I guess I never really thought about this because I've only been at, bigger churches, but can a nominating committee nominate a non-session member to session? So if you're on the nominating committee, can you nominate somebody who's on the nominating committee for session?
Yes,
Okay.
You may. Robert's rules allow serving on the nominating committee does not disqualify you from being nominated. That's the Robert rules, not our Constitution, but it's Robert rules. So yes, you may do that. Okie doke. So,
Hey, to
yeah, go ahead.
Steve's question,
Yeah.
it's possible that a church's bylaws have a stipulation that prevents the nominating committee from nominating itself.
Well, they could, that violates Robert rules. So if their bylaws also say they follow Robert's rules, then that's in conflict with each other. You don't have to deal with that mess. You call your congregational consultant. They'll deal with that mess if their bylaws contradict each other. And trust me, they're Chip and I were just looking at a church's bylaws and we're like, these don't make any sense whatsoever. So yeah.
So when the bylaws contradict Robert's rules, which one carries the superseding power?
Robert's rules, because that is the constitutional authority that we use. So it supersedes it over their own thing. And that's an interesting, because there are things that people will have. For example, we had a church where you could not vote. If you're a member of the church, but you cannot vote unless you're 21 years or older. Well, that's a violation of the Constitution. Now, their bylaws said that, but because it violates the Constitution, that had to be changed. So Robert's rules and the Constitution take priority over their bylaws. If they contradict it. They can be a little more stringent, but they can't like totally contradict it. All right. So before we talk about a little bit about Robert's rules, let me just go to the last page in terms of, again, I said about meetings starting and ending. I know some of these small churches can go on for hours. The first church I moderated, I mean, their meetings were like 4 hours long. And part of that is, and that was another thing that was lifted up to me by the consultants, is that some of these smaller churches, they don't really have committees. And so they come to the session expecting the session to do all the committee work. And I'm actually going to ask Chip. Chip had a really great comment about that he shared with me and the consultants about a strategy of what you might be able to do about that.
What was that?
About committees wanting to do the work of the session, and you had made a comment.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, yes, I do remember. I have said to a session at some point, but this was not a session that didn't have committees, but
Okay.
a session that did have committees, and the session wanted to redo all of the committee's work each time a recommendation was brought. And I said to them, okay, we're either going to disband the committees if we want to do all the work here, or we're going to be a little more trustful of our committees and assume that they have done the work that they need to do, and give weight to the recommendation that they bring to us.
So if they don't have committees, what do you think is a good strategy to try to help them to do some of that preliminary work beforehand? Anybody have any ideas on that? Steve?
So not in session meetings, but I just like in other meetings in the workplace. When I lead meetings, I think the understanding is that when you bring something to the meeting, that your decision has already been made. You've already made the decision about what is going to be done, and we are voting either to confirm that or not. So, for instance, like, the question is, what are we going to change the time of our worship session, our worship meeting? If there's a worship committee, or well, and so I guess that would be, if there's a worship committee, you would want them to talk about that in their committee and bring that. I guess I would hope that if it were something that somebody were bringing to session, they would have already, if it was something that they were working on ahead of time, that would be, that I would know about, that the encouragement would be, look at this issue, make a decision, and bring it that we can discuss it.
Okay, thank you. Russ, you're muted.
Sorry, my mouse was on the wrong screen. Help me understand, Donna, if I'm correct, that to postpone for a definitive period of time is a parliamentary way to say we're going to talk about this later.
Yes.
And so you can postpone to a specific time something that needs further discussion, and then without having a committee to refer it back to, you simply say, this is something you all need to resolve before we bring it back before the session.
I would think you could do that. I think another option would be, let's say that this is a church that doesn't really kind of have committees. Using Steve's example, let's see if we can change worship time to 10:30 rather than 11 o'clock. So session, what should we do about that? One thing that you might be able to do, and I'm just kind of talking, but one thing that you might be able to do as the moderator is say, normally a decision like that would come from a committee. Doesn't sound like you have a committee, a worship committee. Yes? Yeah, no, we don't have a worship committee. Okay, well, why don't we have a person on the session, maybe an usher or somebody who counts the offering. If there's a music person, let's see if we can get them together and explore that issue. And then you as the session member come back and let us know. In other words, kind of form an ad hoc committee if they don't have a committee, so that you're not sitting there having a 3-hour discussion. Should we go to 10:30 worship? Does that make sense? I'm just throwing that out there. Does that make sense? Russ?
It makes sense, but is that not creating a task force?
Well, then
If they have a
if they don't have a committee.
But I mean, helping them understand it without committees, that's a great way to get things like that done, introducing that into the culture to say, this is a group gathered for a specific task for a specific
Okay.
time. We're not looking for extended commitment. We're looking for an answer.
Okay, that I think that's good. George, you have your hand up. I was told.
Yeah, what if, so I guess what the question that came to my mind is, if they're not willing to do the work, do you just continue to postpone until they get around to that? Or, because it may be, we're talking kind of loosey-goosey about some of those situations. So how do you try to encourage them to get somewhat decent and in order?
Well, and that may just simply be as the moderator that if you don't go the task force route, that you say, it sounds like this is a big issue about changing the time for worship. We probably need to establish a worship committee in order to further explore this. So how are we gonna get a worship committee together? So maybe you just have to be directive and in the lead and actually help them understand that that's a work outside of the session, that the session then deals with the recommendation, but the actual exploration, what is the impact in parking? What is the impact in terms of our elderly people or families? Can they get up that early or that late or whatever? So that they actually understand that that's the work of what a session does. And, maybe that's some of the learning things. Joy had reminded us all in our conversation, you are teaching elders. And so part of what you may be doing is having to do some teaching. So maybe you look at the Book of Order, what it talks about sessions responsibilities. Our responsibilities is for worship. So how are we going to carry that out if we don't have a committee? What would be the best way in this place to take care of that? Those are my suggestions. Other people might have some other suggestions, and they may rebel against that. But the other thing too is also, if you're religious about starting on time and ending on time, well, we didn't make a decision about worship time because our time is up. So does somebody want to deal with that outside of this, or are we going to have this conversation at every session meeting? Chip, are you want to say anything?
Well, I was just going to say, and I've had this experience recently. When
Tell us.
when you're moderating a session where you're not the pastor, it gives you the ability to be a little sharper, a little more blunt, and to say, folks, we could talk about this all night, but this is your decision, and we need to find a way to make this decision because I'm not going to let this meeting go on all night. So, to push a little bit and say, you all help me come up with a way that we're going to reach a decision on this rather than just discuss it ad infinitum.
Thank you. And that's not going to change overnight. Just know that. If you encounter that that's the ethos of this church, that's not going to change overnight, and that's going to be a gradual kind of a thing. So, but hopefully maybe you can educate them.
Donna?
I did put, I don't know what time is it, guys? Okay, it's about 7 o'clock. I don't want people to be intimidated by parliamentary procedure. I kind of wrote out the basics, and then Katie Allman teaches parliamentary procedure at the seminary, and she gave me this parliamentary patter. I sent that to you all, right? Did I send that to you? Yeah. So those were some of the main things. I think the thing to remember is, number one, in smaller churches, they won't do a whole lot of parliamentary procedure. They just won't do that, just because they're a family and they're just smaller churches. Some of them though will. Some of them will. But the important thing about it is, an action item or a motion does need to formally be on the floor if you're going to have a vote about anything. So somehow, and of course you can't make that because you're not a member of the session. So you would say, after the conversation, I make a motion that we, have worship at 10:30 or whatever. And then as the moderator, then your job is to facilitate the conversation so that as many voices are heard that are willing to be heard. As Russ said, some people won't talk, but you encourage that. If somebody keeps talking and talking or keeps going back and dominates, as the moderator, it is appropriate to say, Julie, thank you so much for those comments, but we really haven't heard from Sandy and Sam or whatever, and I would really like to ask if they have something that they would like to add to the conversation. We want to make sure that we hear everyone's opinions and everyone's voices. And so sometimes you will have to be directive like that as a moderator, that's so that somebody does not dominate the conversation. Or if they start getting on a tangent, well, my cousin, they worship at 2 o'clock. So maybe we should think about worshiping in the afternoon, or, I mean, those are for the discussions beforehand. But, if someone starts to go way off, you've got to, as the moderator, you got to bring them back and say, you know what, that is an idea, but right now the motion is, do we want to change to 10:30? If you want to have further conversation about a different kind of a time, then you vote this motion down, and then we have a committee that goes and studies it and brings us a recommendation about what's the best thing to do. So that's another way you can handle it. So, I mean, Chip is right, whereas, this isn't, you can be a little bit more directive. So you do need a motion. You do need a second. You don't need to record those names. Your clerk of session knows that. You don't have to necessarily do the names. And then, you call for the motion when people have discussed it. So those are that. And then let me ask you, Bobby Wren and Becky, because you were specifically in smaller churches, did they ever do amendments to any of your motions, or how did they operate parliamentary wise? I'm just curious. Or did they not? Did they just say, yeah, let's just do that?
I've encountered that for the first time, I think, at this new church.
Okay.
And one of my stronger personalities corrected me on Robert's rules. And after this happened 2 or 3 times in the meeting, I said, I'm new to you and I'm rusty on this. And so would you just be our parliamentarian for this meeting? And he agreed to, and we moved on, and we followed his suggested procedure because we weren't going to get anywhere until we did.
Okay.
And so, but I never, at the other church, that was very unusual.
So they stuck with the formalized kind of procedures.
But they were pretty dependent on their clerk for guidance, and she's super. She is super, which is, I always called her a benevolent dictator. And I just felt very fortunate that she had such good judgment and was so invested in the church. But it did, a lot of, who knows what we would have gotten if there'd been more input and discussion. Mm-hmm. That's why I was so shocked when I encountered the first motion that came up. Well, 5 minutes into the discussion, there was an amendment. And I'm thinking, now what do I do?
Okay.
So
okay, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you.
It is. I mean, and I was so grateful for these notes because there it all is. And
well, and your clerk should know about it. And I will say, as a moderator, if you encounter something that you're not really sure what to do, you can turn to the clerk and say, so-and-so, can you help us discern what is the appropriate parliamentary steps? And if they don't know, then that's a problem. But that's why I did this, because you really should be familiar with some of the basic kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. The basic kind of stuff is a motion. The basic kind of stuff is an amendment. You have to deal with the amendment first. You only deal with one at a time. If somebody wants to change something, and then when you have a conversation, you only talk about the amendment. You don't talk about the main motion. You have to talk about the amendment first. Then you have to vote on the amendment. And if it fails, then you go back to the original. Was this clear in terms of what I wrote out? Do you feel like you have the basics of some of those basics? Okay.
And I wish I had it before my first session meeting with them. So for those of you who are just learning to moderate, this is going to be your Bible. This is great.
That's good.
Well, and I also have a more involved pamphlet. If you do take on a church and you would like to have that, let me know and I'll send it to you. It's like, but I don't want you to get freaked out by this motion has greater relevance than this one and blah, 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 blah. I don't think you're going to deal with all that kind of stuff. You'll deal with regular motions, you'll deal with amendments, and you'll deal with, I don't know in a smaller church if this will happen or not, but Russ may deal with this in terms of the moderator, the presbytery. Somebody will call the question. I think every Presbyterian has heard that before. I call the question. It's very important to remember that as the moderator, you don't have to recognize that motion. If you think someone is making it to cut debate off, or if you think someone is doing that so that so-and-so can't be heard because so-and-so disagrees with you or whatever, you can say, you know what, I think we still need to talk about this. I'm not going to recognize that motion at this time. We still need some further discussion. When you do feel that you're at a point to vote, you go back to that person and you say, would you please go ahead and make that motion now? Tully, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a friend who was elected moderator of another Presbyterian, went to moderator training. And one of the things he told me after his moderator training that I was like, really, that doesn't seem like you should be allowed to do that, was that when you get into all of these amendments and it gets messy, that the moderator has the power to just sort of start over.
No, you don't really.
That's what I thought.
No, you don't. That's why these pre-discussions are more helpful before you get into all of that stuff. Russ is shaking his head. Do you have something to say, Russ?
Well, I was shaking my head of telling you, no, you're not allowed to just start over. But I'm wondering, Donna, you spoke of the assistant clerk at a GA. When she did ModCon, she had little like pop-up flashcards for moderators to use as a way for the moderator to keep themselves on track. So whether with the motion or the amendment or an amendment to the amendment, and it was just a visual cue that you had your little stack of cards. Okay, where are we? And then it also had that quick reference on it of this requires a second. This doesn't require a second. This stops debate. All those kind of quick cues. I was curious if you have that.
I don't, but I am going to ask her. Trisha did that?
I will send it to you.
Oh, I would love to have that. That would be great. And then we can send it to all of you too.
Please do.
So are they actual little cards like we cut up and you've made your own card? Is that what
it's a little, it is.
Oh, fabulous. Oh my gosh. You're my new best friend, Russ. How about that? That does raise a very good point, because as the moderator, you don't have to pay attention to the content of what is being discussed. You have to pay attention to who has spoken for, who has spoken against, are we in order? You have to monitor and manage the debate. You may not even hear a word of what somebody is saying because you're having, certainly on a larger level. I mean, and if you ever do moderate a larger church that maybe is in an interim before they get their interim or something, you may do that. But I know, and Russ probably can speak to that too, but I mean, I know that when I've moderated large gatherings, I've got a little score sheet, for, against, because you don't want 20 people for and 2 people against. You need to manage it so that it's even and manage it so that people have spoken. And you may not even remember who has said what, because it's not your job to pay attention to the content of the debate. Does that make sense? Just to manage the debate is what your responsibility is. So I wanted to tell you about that. Yeah, calling the question, and that you don't have to recognize that if you don't want to. If those flashcards will probably be the most helpful thing that Russ can share with us all. So, but again, in these little small churches, I don't think you're going to get into an amendment to an amendment. You only deal with one amendment. Just say, we're only dealing with one amendment at a time. Let's perfect that amendment. Let's vote on that amendment. Then we go back to the regular. It just keeps everybody in order. And technically that is the correct thing to do. So, all right. Sticky situations. Steve, as a moderator, is it fair to say that our role is like the referee? Oh, that's that's interesting. I think it's more like the manager. I don't know. I'm a football fan, so I have a very distinct understanding of what a referee is, I guess, whether or not you violated the rules or whatever. It's not, it's more about managing so that everybody can be heard and that it's not heavily weighted. We don't get a whistle. No, we don't get a whistle. I mean, you can bring your own whistle if you want to, Steve. Probably not the best of ideas. Okay. Somebody's dominating the conversation. Anybody have some ideas of how to help steer them off of that domination? Anybody encounter that or have any ideas about what might be helpful?
Well, I've had that when I've led retreats.
Oh, okay. Tell us about it, Jill.
And so you will have somebody that usually has a lot of good information to share, but then it goes on too long. And I usually will interrupt, or I usually use some kind of physical gesture, like,
Okay.
you know, like, thank you so much for sharing. And then I'll review the points that I've heard them say, you know, and it's like,
Okay.
you've said a lot, so let me make sure I've got all this and that we hear what you're saying. And then I want to get some feedback from other people, either about what you've said or about this topic in general, because I want them to feel heard and not feel like they've been interrupted, because, you know, as a retreat leader, or even as a guest moderator, you don't want an us versus them type thing.
That mean old lady cut me off. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want them, you know, I let them know that they've been heard by reviewing the points that I've heard them say, and then I invite others into the conversation.
I think that's great. That's a great strategy. Yeah, Chip.
I was in a conference where Barbara Brown Taylor was one of the speakers, and I just thought it was brilliant. Someone wanted to ask a question. It was one of those questions that goes on and on and on and on and on. And she, after a minute or two, just broke in and said, I have some answers. Are you ready to hear them? And there was no way for them to go on after that. So I thought it was a brilliant way to address that.
Oh, that was interesting. That is interesting. Well, she's phenomenal anyway. Anybody else have any other kind of strategies? Yeah, Bobby Wren.
One of my favorite lines is after thanking them for their contribution to say, just for the sake of time, we need to move on. That's been a great thing for you to share, but for the sake of time, we need to move on. Or to just break in and say, for the sake of time, we need to move on. Can you bring your comment to a close? Would you like to underscore your point? Something.
Perfect. And then that's also helped to clarify what it is that they're trying to say also. Yeah, which is important. How do you control side conversations? I'm sure none of you have ever had that problem, right? No?
With your whistle.
Yes. Say what? What? Oh, your whistle. Yes. Becky, have you had that?
What I finally did was just, since we're meeting on Zoom, ask them to raise the hand and let me recognize them so that I can focus on the one person who's speaking, that I can't keep up with them. And on Zoom, it really is hard, that even the computer gets confused about which box to highlight, you know, because they're all talking at the same time. But Zoom gives us a big advantage with that issue.
Yeah. Well, and you probably can even do that in person. You can say, I hear Joe and Susie, I hear you talking. It's helpful to me if one person at a time is talking. If you'd like to make your comment, would you please raise your hand so I can recognize you?
Mm-hmm.
That's an appropriate thing to do. Russ, were you going to say something?
Well, that's what I've done with the folks that get into the side conversations at the far end of the table, is just in a very, sort of polite substitute teacher voice. It's simmer, children. Let's stay on task. That, to me, that's one of the gifts that Robert's Rules of Order gives us, though, is because it lets us frame the conversation, keep the conversation on track, and call folks back to the issue which then either reveals, okay, they were talking about something relevant, or they were figuring out what they're doing after the meeting. As an aside to that, just so you all recognize in the chat, I've dropped those two, she called them Post-it notes for moderators. So those are PDFs in the chat now.
And you know what? In my limited technological ability, can you email that to me? Because I don't know how to get it out of the chat. See, your next clerk, you won't have to worry about any of that stuff with your next clerk. You'll be so.
I got you, Donna.
Oh, you got me? Thank you,
I
Chip.
can't either, so thanks.
Thank you, Chip.
Donna
I
said-
just don't know how to get it out of there, so.
But I will
But again,
add-
and yeah, I think that the key again is, like you say, be polite. I think I like what Jill too also said, acknowledge that someone's been hurt or whatever, or you know, just say, oh, is that something that's relevant to our conversation? So, okay, say more about addressing the moderator. This really, well, yeah, you could actually use it in small gatherings too. Technically, by Robert's rules, if anybody has anything to say, there's actually supposed to say it to the moderator and not to the body there. Sometimes, like in a large Presbyterian meeting, you'll get somebody who wants to make an impassioned speech and they'll turn around and they'll talk to the body, and you have to say, excuse me, but you need to address the moderator. So you can even do that in a small setting. Again, the thing is, because this is really family-oriented churches, you just have to do it in a tender way so that it's not, you know, so that it's heard in the spirit that, you know, that you're giving it, and not chastisement or whatever. But yes, if it gets to that point and they refuse to do that, you can say, you know, folks, it would be really helpful if you address your comments to the moderator. That's really the kind of the way we do things in the church, and so that will be helpful so everybody can hear the pertinent information. So that's what that means. So this might be, if members of the congregation, if they normally have open meetings, you may want to talk to your clerk beforehand. How does that work in your setting? Because people are not really allowed to talk. Do they talk? I mean, you can just say, how does that work? Do people just kind of silently listen to what's being said, or do you tend to see people wanting to make comments? Just so you have a lay of the land. And if they want to make comments, if that's their culture, what you might want to do is at the very beginning of the meeting, when you're setting the tone, say, oh, it's delighted to see all these other folks here who are not on the session, who are here to listen to our business. That's fabulous that you're so invested in the church. I do want to just remind you, though, that because you're not on the session, you don't have a right to speak. So I'm delighted that you're here, but just a reminder that those are the rules. So you can do that in a gentle way at the very beginning of the meeting, so that hopefully then they don't interrupt you and they don't bop in and they don't talk. A lot of, I will say, in the sessions that I've been in that are open, most of those people know that they shouldn't interrupt or whatever. But they also, though, might talk amongst themselves, which is interruptive to the session too. So you have to also deal with that. George, you got your hand up?
Yeah, don't they technically have to be invited to the session meeting?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if you were there. Technically, all meetings are closed, but if the ethos of the church is that their meetings are open, then they're open. If they normally have open meetings, then no, they don't have to be invited. If they normally do not have open meetings, then an invitation needs to be extended. It's one of those loosey kinds of things.
So if you have an open invitation environment, do you still recognize them as guests to the meeting, which then gives you the formal opportunity to say they're here, but they have no voice unless elected to have a voice?
You certainly can do that if you feel that would help with the order. Or you can just, I mean, and again, this is a conversation with your clerk in terms of the ethos. Do you write everybody's name down that they're here as a guest? How do you normally do that? They can all be recorded as a guest or whatever, or you can just simply say, oh, I see we have guests at this meeting. Lovely. Just a reminder. And so you just go ahead and take it upon yourself and call them a guest and remind them that they can't talk.
Okay.
But find out from the clerk beforehand, would they normally talk so that you're prepared? So, yeah. This was an interesting comment that was made by one of the consultants about a suggestion that came from a session that was very non-reformed. And a reminder that, again, we are teaching elders. There was a comment about how communion was extended to the community, and why don't we do communion kits and we'll just pass them out to people in the neighborhood. Now, first of all, my hope and prayer is you know why that's not reformed. I'm gonna assume that you all know why that's not reformed, because we believe that the body communes together. It's not an individualistic kind of thing. So let's say somebody makes such a suggestion like that. As the moderator, it is also an opportunity for you to be a teaching elder and say, you know, communion is a wonderful thing, but in our tradition, we do that together because we believe the body of Christ is something that we share together and that God is in our midst and it's not a private affair. So that would not be an appropriate thing, but maybe there is something appropriate we can share with the community about ourselves or whatever that would be pertinent to our mission. So you might be able to say something that they could do if they make a suggestion of something that they can't do. But again, that's a part or a reminder, like Joy says, that you are a teaching elder. You might come up with some situations like that where you then can gently also help educate them as well. Because who knows how much training they're getting, especially if they're in a church that doesn't have a pastoral presence. They may not be getting any training. And that might be something as a moderator, if you stay with a church for a year or 2 years, that you might even want to do as part of your meetings, a little 15-minute, let's brush up on what it is to be an elder. You know, maybe take a topic and say, let's talk about whatever. I mean, it might be an opportunity to have like a 15-minute or a 10-minute teaching moment within the session meeting about what it is to be an elder. You know, how do we count money? Oh, you know, you have to have 2 people to do that or whatever, you know, whatever. So just throw that out there as something that was given to me. Now, I've actually been in session meetings where people have shouted and screamed at each other. I don't know if any of you have ever been in those kind of meetings. And that, as the moderator, you have to take control. You absolutely have to take control. You have to say, you need to stop. This is not how we address each other. This is not respectful. If you can't be respectful in this meeting, I'm going to adjourn it right now. You have to take control of a situation like that. Because trust me, I've even been in where there's this. So there you go. So as the moderator, I think one of the qualities of be confident. You know it all. If you're confident, then they'll feel like things are going to happen correctly if you're confident. That's really important.
Donna, I'm curious, in the situation where you said they got to the point of fighting in fisticuffs and yelling and screaming at one another, were there preemptive moves that should have been made before it got there? Because I've never had one get out of control like that, even though I've had people who were volatile.
I am so glad that you haven't. I think some of it was the volatile personalities. There were some, obviously this was behavior that had been allowed to continue, and like I kind of stepped into it. And so if they had been allowed to continue, then they are obviously going to continue that kind of behavior. That's why you have to take control right away and say, we don't talk to each other that way. And we're not going to talk to each other that way. We can have a respectful conversation. We can agree to disagree. If you're not able to do that, we are going to adjourn right now until you're able to do that.
Okay.
So in those particular situations, it was kind of the ethos, and it had been allowed. And so
you just inherited it.
I inherited it, yeah. So I don't think any of these churches have that experience that I'm aware of. I haven't heard from our consultants that any of these churches are like that. But, you know, there can be some heated conversations, obviously, if there's some serious disagreements. So again, as the moderator, your job is to calm it down. Take control and calm it down. You want people to be able to be heard, but you need to have it calm down. George, do you have your hand up again? Is that what that is? Or, you got a little check mark in your box, so I don't know. if
No,
that-
I was agreeing with what you were saying.
Oh, okay.
I did have a volatile, when we were closing the school that had been open for 50 years, we had a really bad meeting, as you can well imagine. So,
Yes,
and
lots of emotion.
a lot of emotions and people from the congregation who were invited guests, who wanted to have their comments heard. And so it was very, I mean, we got out of it all right, but staying cool when people are losing their heads around you is the hard part. I think it's that pastoral presence bit that's
Yes.
so important.
And I think in that situation, of course, I wasn't there. I don't really know about it, but I'll just kind of imagine if people were also making their own comments, it may also have been appropriate or could be appropriate to say, this sounds like we need a town hall meeting so that we can hear everybody's opinions. This is a session meeting right now, and it's session members that are allowed to speak. If the session feels like we need to hear all the voices, then let's table this, call a town hall meeting and have a conversation about this issue. You're raising your hand, George?
No, that's a thumbs up.
Oh, okay. I don't know all these little thingies, sorry.
Donna, another thing that I have done when you
Yeah.
get a group that's starting to get too emotionally volatile is simply stop in the middle of the agenda and pray.
Absolutely. I was going to say that next. I'm glad you beat me to it. But prayer is always appropriate at any point in time. Also before a difficult vote. Also, you have to remember, I mean, as you know, I mean, this is their church. It's near and dear to their heart. They love it. And, they may be grieving things or whatever, but it's hard. I mean, and we're outside of it because especially you will be a little more outside of it because you're not even there on a week-to-week kind of a basis. And so it's just helpful to be reminded that, people carry a lot of emotion, and also as a moderator and calming presence is to help invoke the Holy Spirit to help with that calmness. Absolutely. All right, we have 4 more minutes in terms of my clock. And again, I want to be faithful to the time. Does anybody have any other questions or comments? Or I hope this was helpful. I would love to have any feedback of how to make it help. This is the first time I've ever done this. So if anybody has any comments you want to send to me or whatever, I'd love to entertain it so that I can try to improve on because I think that they're going to continue to do this moving forward.
A question.
Yeah, Bobby Wren.
Where does it come in to look at the minutes of the last meeting?
It comes in the very beginning of the meeting. Usually it's approved.
I didn't see it on that list of things that you do.
Let
but,
me add that on there. Thank you very much.
But that would be
That's yeah,
standard.
that's right away. After you
Does
do your
that-
quorum,
Is there a vote?
there you go. Okay.
Isn't there a
After you-
vote to approve them or
Approve,
not?
yeah, approve the minutes
To a motion.
from file. Yeah, I'll add that in there. Thank you. It's under moderating and parliamentary procedure. It would be number 3.
Okay.
Approve the minutes from the previous meeting. Thank you.
Donna, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that doing this is doing the work of the presbytery.
Mhm.
We have to travel, like some of the churches are, quite a distance away.
Yes.
Is there mileage? Do they pay mileage? Or tell me about that.
Thank you, Jill. I'm glad you said that. The fee to moderate is $75 to moderate the meeting, and you get mileage. And yes, a lot of these churches are like in Grange, or they're a far piece away. You're not going to get rich. I'll own that. You're not going to get rich, but there is a small monetary compensation. If they're in a church that doesn't have pastoral presence, they may ask you to preach and do communion that day because they also need somebody to do communion. There are greater fees. I have a fee scale. I'll send that all to you. It's guidelines. We can't mandate it. No, we don't charge by the hour. Sorry, but we have a guideline scale depending on the size of the church. If it's one one session or I mean, one service or two services or whatever. So yes, but we would consider it a great contribution to the presbytery because we are struggling in this area. And let me close with saying, if any of you are interested and would like to consider it, send me an email and I'll tell you what's out there, what might be the best work for you, and when they meet, because that's another thing. Like, for example, Tully, if you're in worship all the time, you probably could not do one right after their worship unless that was like a 2 p.m. or something. So I can give you all that pertinent information after I talk to the consultants and get all that further information. So I do hope that you will prayerfully consider. And this is not a lifetime appointment. We do want to ask to a year if possible, because then that gives the church a little consistency, because it's hard for them as well to have all kinds of people coming in and out. But if you find that it doesn't work, obviously we're not gonna hold you to it. But we would prayerfully ask that you might consider to do it for a year, if you choose to do that.
Donna, just by way of feedback, since you had asked for some.
Yes, please.
One thing that might be a helpful piece, particularly for those who are coming out of a non-traditional sort of church background at this point, is that you had a sample agenda available.
Got it.
So for instance, I know you've got to hear what are your responsibilities, but we always have our motions and action items at the beginning of the agenda, and then we have our discussion items, and then we have our team and committee reports, so that where the highest energy is going to be is at the front. You're front loading the agenda. If you had some sort of sample guide like that, that might be helpful for folks.
I do have some sample agendas in my stated clerk's handbook, and I can pull those out. And again, that would probably be a good thing before, as you meet with the clerk beforehand, say, could you show me the agenda from the last 2 or 3 meetings? Because again, they may have a whole different viewpoint of how they want to conduct their meeting, but that's very helpful. Okay.
In the parliamentary pattern document you sent out, I think I found a typo.
Oh, okay, that's a Katie thing, but I just used it with her permission, so.
It's under when considering a motion to call the question.
Yeah.
The second to last paragraph, if discussion is ended, we will not move to consider the motion.
I think what they mean is.
We will now move.
Oh, that it might be now, I'll see. To call the question, there's no debate. So it also could be, we will not move to consider, meaning we won't debate the motion. I don't know what she means. I'll ask her what she meant. She put this together, so. But thank you. It may be that it's not, so. Any last comments, folks? Send them on my way.
Okay, Donna, I have a question.
Yeah.
So maybe I couldn't find anything, the information, but I'm just curious. Do we have the due date to send out the agenda to the session meeting before the meeting? Do we have any guideline?
No, there's no guidelines. Everybody does it differently. That again would be the question that you would ask the clerk. When do you normally send out any materials, or when should we work on this agenda? And if they say, oh, we always do it the day before, you might say, you know what? I'm kind of new, getting used to all this. I would really be helpful if we could do it 4 days or so in advance. So you can direct.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Chip, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're such a good prayer. Would you pray us out of here? I do love your prayer. A motion to adjourn. Yes. Chip, pray us out, please.
Let's pray. God, we thank you for this time together and for all of this helpful information that's been shared. In all of this, remind us that the most important thing is not the procedure that we use, but that we help churches to do the business that is before them in ways that are faithful and constructive and helpful, and that further their work towards your kingdom. Allow us in all that we do with the sessions of our churches and then the other ministry that we do, to be working towards the goals which you put before us. When that is true, strengthen us. When that is not true, gently correct us. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all, and
Yeah.
feel free to send any more suggestions if you have any, and prayerfully consider. And if you would like to do this adventure, let me know and we'll get you connected. So, all
Great.
right.
Thanks.
Thank
Good
you
to see
all very much
everybody.
for your time. I really appreciate it.